So many parents wish that they could quit their jobs to spend more time with their kids. But when you have a job that's making over 6 figures, that is a very hard decision to make, and many can't afford it. So what if you could quit your 6-figure job and replace that within 1 year while all working at home? Well, today we're gonna find out how this happened. This is a true story, how this wife quit her job and how the husband replaced her $100,000 per year income with an online business. We're gonna find out how he did it right now. What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to Wealth Hacker TV, the channel dedicated to teaching you new ways to grow wealth that is not taught to you in schools or by your parents. I am your gracious host, Jeff Rose, and this is another amazing installment of the Make 1K series. So what this series is all about, we are featuring successful entrepreneurs, but we're not here just to have them boast about how much money they're making and how awesome they are. No, we want to find out the root, the origin story, what they had to go through to get to where they are today. So what were those pain points? What were those obstacles? What were those limiting beliefs and barriers they had to overcome? That's what this series is all about. And today I get to feature a very good friend of mine, Steve Chu. So Steve Chu is he is a online entrepreneur juggernaut. So he's got an amazing blog. He's got an amazing course. He has an e-commerce store. He also has a summit that he has founded. I mean, this guy is legit, and he's also a family man, and I think he likes In-N-Out Burger, so I gotta give some props for that. But no, Steve has actually been a very good friend of mine, and it is a pleasure to feature him today on this series. So Steve, tell us about your business and what you're all about right now.
So we actually have a lot of businesses, but the one business that kind of kicked everything off was our e-commerce store over at BumblebeeLinens.com. And this is a business where we sell handkerchiefs online. Now you might think selling handkerchiefs is a little bit random, but back in the day when my wife and I first got married, she knew she was gonna cry at the wedding. And because we paid a lot of money for photography, she didn't want to be photographed using like ratty tissues to dry her tears of joy. So we looked all over the place for handkerchiefs in the US, couldn't find any. Finally, we found this factory in China, and we ended up having to buy a couple of hundred of these hankies. And what ended up happening is we placed a large order, we used maybe a handful of handkerchiefs, and we had a lot left over, so we put them on eBay, and they ended up selling like hotcakes. So later on, when we decided to start our business, we actually got back in touch with that vendor, and we imported a bunch of hankies, and we decided to launch our e-commerce store at Bumblebee Linens. Now, Bumblebee Linens ended up doing really well. We ended up making over 6 figures in profit in our first year of business. And naturally, I decided to document our journey. And so I started a blog over at mywifequitherjob.com, and that ended up taking off like crazy. And that led to a podcast of the same name. It led to a training class, and then it also led to an annual e-commerce conference over at the Seller Summit. So in a nutshell, those are all my businesses, which started from my first e-commerce store over at Bumblebee Linens. So as you guys probably know, starting a wedding handkerchief store is super random. And the backstory was, when my wife and I first became pregnant with our first child, my wife wanted to quit her job. And you gotta understand, back in the day, we had this routine where we would, wake up, eat breakfast, and then my wife would go to me and she'd make this really long face and she'd say, "All right, honey, I'm off to the hellhole I call my job." And then she would go to work, she would come back, we would have dinner, and then we'd watch TV maybe for a couple of hours and then go to sleep. And then the next day we would repeat that same thing over and over and over again. And so when we became pregnant with our first child, she told me she wanted to quit her job, and I'm fully on board with the parents staying at home with our child. But we were worried because we live in the Silicon Valley, where it's super expensive to live here, and you pretty much need 2 incomes in order to afford a good house in a good school district. And so we looked at a number of different business ideas, and then we remembered back when we got married, we sold handkerchiefs on eBay and they sold like hotcakes. So we decided to get back in touch with that vendor, imported a bunch of handkerchiefs, and started BumblebeeLinens.com. And in terms of the blog, the reason I got inspired to start the blog was because I was reading this blog by Steve Plavlina. And for all of you guys who don't know who this guy is, he is a personal development blogger. And he wrote this one blog post, how to make your first love dollar. And in that post, he talked about how he's making all this money from his writings on his blog. I think at the time he was making $4,000 a day. And I was totally inspired by that. And so mywifequitherjob.com, which is my blog, ended up becoming my retirement plan. And fast forward 7 years later, I was actually able to quit my job based on the earnings of mywifequitherjob.com. You know, what's funny is I actually didn't really have a mentor during this entire journey. My wife and I, we pretty much fumbled our way through the entire process. However, I did have a lot of colleagues that helped me out. So one person that greatly helped me out was my brother-in-law, who introduced me to Google AdWords. And Google AdWords was responsible for making our initial sales on Bumblebee Linens. And in terms of the blogging world, I kind of just fumbled around and just wrote random blog posts. But it wasn't until I attended my first conference, which was FinCon, where I met a whole bunch of other bloggers within the same niche. And what ended up happening is after making friends with these other bloggers, we ended up collaborating and linking to each other with our blogs, and we all grew together. So while I didn't have an explicit mentor, I did learn a lot from my various colleagues. But there's no one person that really helped me greatly. So I would say the primary obstacle that I faced early on was getting the website up and running. You gotta remember, this is back in 2007. This is before Shopify, this is before BigCommerce. My wife and I, we pretty much had to fumble our way into creating this website. I had to learn HTML, I had to learn web development, and it was all just a huge hassle. Today, obviously, that's not the case. Another thing that was really difficult for us was starting a business was such a lonely process. Even though we live in the Silicon Valley where there's startups left and right, most of the startups here are venture-backed. There aren't a lot of people here starting lifestyle businesses. And so both my wife and I, we felt alone through the entire process. It wasn't until we actually were able to go to conferences did we actually meet like-minded individuals, and after that it got a whole lot better. And obviously the final obstacle that we faced early on was getting traffic to the site. I remember for our e-commerce store, we were selling wedding handkerchiefs, right? I would actually pose as a female on the wedding forums, interact with all the other brides and try to get them to our site that way, and sales trickled in a little bit that way. And with the blog, to be quite frank, I just wasn't a very good writer. And in fact, I was so bad that my mom wasn't even reading my stuff, and it took me a whole long time to develop the writing skills. It took me a long time to figure out how the whole SEO and ranking and search game worked. Just getting traffic to both the blog and the online store was a huge learning curve for me in the beginning. All right, so I'm gonna talk about how I made my first 1K with our e-commerce store, as well as my blog. And there's just two different stories there. So with the e-commerce store, we made our first $1,000 through Google AdWords. But we actually had a three-prong attack with our e-commerce store. So one, we were running pay-per-click advertising via Google AdWords. We were writing articles. These were like craft tutorials, which actually got traffic via Google search, organic Google search. People would find our site and we would guide people from the articles over to our products. And the third prong was, what ended up happening is when we started selling wedding handkerchiefs online, we ended up getting a lot of customers who purchased from us in bulk. So what we ended up doing is we ended up reaching out to these people who turned out to be event planners. We offered them a single point of contact, special coupon codes, and we actually got them on as repeat customers. So the combination of those three factors allowed us to make our first $1,000 with our e-commerce store. Whereas with my blog, it was an entire different story. When you write random blog posts on a blog, it's really hard to make money unless you have a strategy in place. And in the beginning, I did what everyone else does who has a blog. I put on Google AdSense. And I remember it took many, many months to even get that first $100 check. It wasn't until I started introducing affiliate offers with my blog did I actually make my first $1,000 online. And what I did is I would create these YouTube tutorials where I would have someone click on an affiliate link on my blog and then go through with the tutorial. And that way people like to follow these tutorials step by step, so they would actually click on the link, sign up, and then I would make the affiliate commission that way. So in terms of our e-commerce store, we pretty much started making money right away as soon as we started advertising. And as soon as I put up that first ad, money just started coming in and we were making money overnight. With the blog, however, it was a lot harder. And I would say for the first 3 years, I wasn't making any money at all. It wasn't until a lot of my articles started getting indexed in search, it wasn't until I started mastering social media, did I actually start making meaningful revenue via affiliates. And then I also started an online course, and that's actually when revenue started blowing up. And I remember the first time I did a webinar. I did a webinar and I had the cart closed 3 days later, and I made over $50,000 in the span of 72 hours. Orders were coming in while I was sleeping. I just did this one webinar and this lump sum of money came in. And so I started doing these webinars once per month. Now, if I were to start this all over again, I would stress the importance of having the ability to bring people back to your site over and over again. I remember when I first got started, I made the mistake of just putting content out there, people would read it and then it would disappear. And it wasn't until I started gathering email addresses, gathering other means of reaching out to a customer to bring them back over and over and over and over again until they were ready to buy, did my blog actually take off. So I would say, the number one piece of advice would be to have some sort of mechanism to get people to come back and to own your own platform. I've been burned so many times by Facebook changing their algorithms, Google changing their algorithms, and the only thing that's been very constant across all my businesses has been email marketing. Yeah, so I just want to close this by saying, when it comes to starting an online business, it can actually be really scary. And oftentimes it's really hard to get started. And so the best way to actually get started is just to tell yourself the following things. One, these days starting an online business is super cheap, so there's no monetary risk whatsoever. Second of all, you need to just have something in place that you can actually work off of. I remember I was actually thinking about starting my blog for like a good 6 months, but I couldn't get myself to get started. Finally, I just decided to install WordPress, and once I installed my website, I actually had everything in place where I could actually start writing on a regular basis. And so what you want to do is you want to make it easy for yourself to get started. You want to develop a habit and put it as part of your routine. Before I started my blog, I used to hate writing, and I would dread every time I would have to sit down and actually type at the computer. But instead, what I ended up doing is I set aside 1 day per week to write. And I followed that schedule, and soon enough, writing a blog post per week actually became part of my routine. And today, I don't actually even think anything of it. It's just a part of my regular life. And you gotta remember that slow and steady wins the race. You gotta be consistent, and most people actually quit before they actually start making meaningful money. So if you keep at it, you will eventually succeed.